Okay, welcome everybody. I'm sure we'll have a few late arrivals, but I want to respect all of your time and get started right away. So, a huge welcome to everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar today. My name is Richard Smith. I'm the VP of Sales here over at Rallyware, and I look after the retail business. And it's an absolute pleasure to have Simon Hedaux with me today on the call. How are you doing today, Simon?
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. Appreciate it. Hi, everybody. Thanks for taking the time out.
It's a pleasure. We're privileged to have you, and hopefully myself and everybody on the call today is going to learn an awful lot from the many years of experience you have. So we're going to get started. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get going with the presentation. The call today is very much going to be a sort of fireside chat, so just an open discussion between Simon and I on how we can reimagine retail operations, particularly focus on productivity, which is Simon's area of expertise. But we'd love to get some questions from you guys as well. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat. We will leave some time at the end to answer them. So thank you in advance for doing that. If anything crops up as we're chatting, feel free to make a note of them and then post them in the chat once you're ready. Now, before we get started in the actual discussion, just for some context, for those of you that have not met myself or Simon before, just want to talk very, very briefly about the business that I work for. So firstly, introducing Rallyware. Rallyware is a performance enablement platform. Our goal is to transform every frontline seller into a top performer. And our enterprise suite basically allows retailers and other similar businesses with large remote workforces to improve their performance by making sure they have the right knowledge, information, context to do their best work. So I'm certainly a passionate person when it comes to productivity because I know how important it is to all of our customers. And we also have an additional business within the company, which some of you may have heard of, which is Miyagi by Rallyware. Miyagi was purchased just over 12 months ago by the Rallyware business, works with some amazing retailers and brands, and is very similar in that we're focused on enabling that frontline workforce, but typically it's when the employee doesn't work for you. So for example, a wholesale brand looking to train and educate retailer staff that are part of their dealer network. So that gives you a little bit of context around what we do. A big part of what we talk to retailers about is how technology like ours and others can help improve productivity. And so that's our kind of connection or interest in the topic today. So Simon, I'll hand over to you and just allow you to give the audience a little bit of context about your business as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so at ReThink, we capture data. So you may have heard of old world time and motion studies or productivity reviews. That's what we do in a slightly more modern way. So our team go onto site, we capture data to help you understand how long things take, and we can do some great benchmarking against industry data sets. That really helps out us drive that opportunity to talk to you about. So where's the opportunity to spend more time with customers, to maybe re-engineer the processes that you do, or to even stop doing some things. And most of our clients are using that in a way to try and boost revenue, so to sell more, but also to manage cost in a world where we know over the last kind of 2 to 3 years, cost has really started to increase from supply chain through to product, through to staff costs, property costs, etc. So lots of great insights we can provide to help you do that. And we work with big organizations, kind of most of the top 4 supermarkets, through to telco, DIY, offices, funeral care, anything where there's people doing process. Hopefully we can add some value.
And you're working principally in the US and Europe, is that right, Simon?
Yeah, so lots of work, certainly in the UK, that's where we're based, but then the team are out into Europe. We've got some time in the US later this year, through to really random things like copper mines in Zambia. So again, wherever there's somebody doing something, I'm sure we can add some value.
Wow, very interesting. Well, I look forward to learning a lot more. So before, I was going to drop the slides there. I don't want to kill you all with PowerPoint today. But you speak to a lot of retailers, Simon, and you're pretty connected into that world. So before we get into productivity specifically, I'd be really interested just to know, what you're seeing out there. What's sort of happening in the first part of the year? What are your customers telling you in terms of, their performance and the sort of climate they're trading in?
I think to start off with, it's not all doom and gloom. There's some really good stories out there. Certain industries, as you'll read in the press, doing better than others. Clearly, fashion is very dependent on the weather. DIY seems to be performing well. In the supermarkets, as you see, there's always the competition of where Aldi and Lidl have displaced some of the more longer known retailers. But I think there's common themes: cost, shrink, uncertainty about the pending change in government in the UK, and we've also clearly got an election in the US, a big year for change. And uncertainty tends to bring reluctance at times to make decisions, because people want a solid base to work from, which is understandable. So if we change governments in the UK and the US, what does that mean for business rates, for apprentice levies, for all those things that retailers consider? Probably at the forefront of their minds, certainly lots of the conversation we have is around minimum wage. Lots of organisations struggled last year to manage the delta. The jump was bigger to £11.44 than people thought. How does that look if we remain with our current government? We have a new government. Are those steps smaller, bigger? What are their aspirations to get to this holy land of £15 that's kind of discussed all the time? We hear a lot about shrink. So I think that the big part of shrink is clearly the challenges in retail with shoplifting, how that's publicised more, the gangs, the way it's being done, which is a sign of the economy, but less so about kind of the supplier shrink. So processes in the store that lead to shrink, and all the, I suppose, less newsworthy stories that still have a big impact on retailers. So, yeah, lots of the retailers we work with doing well. It's not all doom and gloom, but there are certainly those pillars of cost shrink and uncertainty that are clouding some of those decisions, or even delaying some of those decisions.
Yeah, I hear you. And we're speaking to a lot of businesses ourselves, though. And as you say, on the positive side, in many of the markets that we work in, retailers are reporting a positive start to the year in terms of actual revenue and volume. And in specialty retail, where we spend a lot of our time, the overstocking crisis that's plagued an awful lot of specialty retail in particular seems to be starting to wash itself through, allowing retailers to clear some of that old stock and start to get some new stock in. So, as you say, certainly not doom and gloom, but some real challenges that businesses still need to overcome. So it was really interesting doing the sort of pre-discussion with you on this, because I thought I knew a little bit about productivity. But as I got into it in some detail with you, I realized that I really don't. And there's so much more to it than kind of meets the eye. But to help everybody that's kind of listening today, let's start with a really broad question about, what is productivity and how do you guys kind of define it and think about it within your business?
So I think, to keep it simple, because we could get really complex and then we'd see people dropping off the call. So let's keep it simple. So can you do more with less, or can you do more with the same people? So it's about throughput, in effect. Can I put things through my business, sales, items and stock on the shelf in a more effective way to mean that I can do more of that work, or I need less people to do it? Therefore, you've got some choices to make of how you do it, or redirect that labour into more what we'd call value adding, so customer facing, revenue driving streams. I would say we're probably at a state where people have done all the easy things. So all the easy productivity gains, and let's stick with the supermarket world. I'm sure in every supermarket, everybody on the webinar shops in, there's probably more self-checkouts now than man checkouts. There's less people at the front. You'll see people picking. So all those low-hanging fruits have been done. So it's about how can we get more out of those people, not working them harder, but working them smarter. Yeah,
no, makes perfect sense. And I suppose it, again, sort of a basic question, but I think it's an important one to ask is, who should care about productivity, both in terms of the type or size of businesses and indeed the sort of roles within the companies themselves as well, I guess.
So normally finance have quite a keen interest, because because they're typically the budget holders or the budget makers, let's say. Operations are probably the gatekeeper, having sat there in some big organizations in retail. So operations always care, because typically the business is asking them, because they're the custodians of the stores, to do more. So can you just put this new promotion on? Can you just put this new stock on the shelf? Can you just do this extra survey for us? Can you just talk to every customer about this new product we've launched? So they care. Clearly everybody at a local level cares, because they're impacted by the output, and ultimately it underpins whether at times you kind of make a profit or not. And we've all seen those retailers that unfortunately have disappeared off the high streets for a number of reasons, but some of it is because they've not kept up with process efficiencies, maybe invested in technology and reimagine that retail estate. So it kind of comes back to everybody. Scale gives you opportunity. So the bigger you are, the smaller the change, the bigger the scale you can run through. Therefore, the more opportunity you've got to reinvest. So everybody we work with, from businesses with 10 people to businesses with 20, 30,000 people, it's on their agenda at the moment, because they understand cost is going to keep being a kind of key pillar of concern, as is shrink and the uncertainty in the world.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned there businesses from sort of 10 employees up to 30,000. My next question is going to be around when should people care? Because I think we've probably got people on the call today that are perhaps from smaller organizations where, this is perhaps new information to them, or bigger organizations where it's the norm to have these type of discussions. When should retail businesses start caring about productivity?
It should be one of those conversations that's ongoing. It's an evolution. It's not a revolution. So it's something that should be part of conversations around how you do things, how can you do things more effectively. I suppose just stepping back slightly to give people a feel of how we do things. Our team come onto site, we observe the processes, help you understand how long they take. Interestingly, if you've got multi-sites, the variance across some of those sites as an example data set becomes really interesting. Why is it different by day of week? Why is it different by leader's day off? What happens if the weather has an impact, if you're a highly seasonal business, etc. So it's something that, if the conversation isn't there, it's probably something that's worth starting to talk about. If you leave it too late, sometimes the delta of change becomes too great and it's too hard to do, and we start to make arbitrary cuts, and that's a really difficult place to come back from then.
Yeah, no, I can absolutely see that. It kind of gets baked in, doesn't it? And it's harder to unseat and change after that point. Whereas I suppose if you sort of start with that mindset when you start your business, of constantly looking for ways in which you can be more efficient and constantly changing the way that you execute things to evolve to the customer's needs, then it can be a huge benefit. We mentioned some of the things that are sort of right at the top of mind for retailers at the moment. You mentioned, cost shrinkage, uncertainty of government. How are those things affecting productivity or the conversation around productivity? Are any of them particularly driving them more than others?
So certainly cost. So how do I extract cost or reuse that cost differently? And it depends on your brand promise. Whether you're very customer led, whether you're very value led, will ultimately impact your operating model, and then how you do things and the cost it takes to do that. Automation is on everybody's agenda as well. So how do I reduce cost by automating? So moving it into a digital world. And again, there's probably a step in there for people to think about on the call. Just lifting and shifting what you do today in a digital world gives you some gains, but actually really challenging why you do some of those things that you're lifting and shifting has far more power. So we don't just take today and turn it into a digital version tomorrow. We really challenge, there's 5 steps in here. How do we get it to 4? Actually, could it be 3? What's the impact on sales, service, customers? So lots of conversation in there around those points, but cost is driving lots of decisions. There's a bit of a paradox though. If you've got locations, the more you try and drive at cost may inadvertently mean you end up with less people, which actually from a shoplifting part of shrink gives those people that want to shoplift a bigger opportunity because there's less presence on the floor. which is then when you circle around to tech of how do you solve it with tech. So again, it's an evolution, not a revolution.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And this was something I found really interesting when we were discussing, because as you said, like, a lot of the quick wins have already been had when it comes to productivity, certainly with retailers that have been at this for a while and are very focused on being as productive as they can. There's a limit, right, to how much kind of you can strip out of the store in terms of the number of employees you've got working on the shop floor, or indeed what you've got those people doing. There's a compromise between being available to service customers and being out the back, bringing the next amount of stock out. So, what are the limits of productivity when we think about balancing that against the customer experience?
So I think it comes back to kind of the individual brand promise, the expectation. So there'll be some retailers we go into, and as a customer, we know there's going to be a high level of interaction. It's maybe a premium brand or a heavily serviced brand because of what they're selling. So you'll expect that. So there's a real watch out that you don't damage that expectation. Others will be a lot more self-service. So we expect the stock to be on the shelves at a low price point, and actually we'll do all the work ourselves. We'll put it in our trolleys, we'll scan it, and we'll leave. So I think the key for me is it's not to be thought of as a cost-cutting exercise, but making sure that you've got people doing the right job at the right cost. So actually your store leaders very stock-led, so therefore you'll be filling the shelves at a higher cost. How do we free up time to serve customers if that's where we think will drive revenue? But ultimately understanding when we're asked centrally to do something, so can you just speak to customers about a new product? What's the cost impact of that? Because for us, it's about having the data to make informed decisions. So as long as a business, you understand this is the cost of putting stock out, this is the cost of automating it and the saving, this is the cost of moving people to a self-checkout model rather than a man-till model. They're all business decisions that could be made then with the right data and the right impact, rather than saying we're going to save 10% of time by putting in this process. Because again, we see sometimes new processes take longer than old processes, but a business has declared a big benefit, and at a local level, the stores and the colleagues can't square off the fact that you've taken hours away from me, but actually what you're asking me to do in real process is taking me longer. So you can become very disengaged if you're not careful.
Yeah, no, you could see that. And do you also see that because those things are kind of competing against each other to some degree, the kind of not every cost exercise is going to compete against the customer experience, but you could see how they could. Do you also see an element of internal kind of friction and debate as well, where you've got the pure operational people that are just trying to kind of bring down those staff hours as much as they can against perhaps the kind of more customer experience focused executives that are really worried about, whether that customer is getting the right experience? Is that tension exist in some of the customers you work with?
Absolutely. And it's a good tension. It's a good conversation to be having at that point. Again, it comes back to what data have you got to help inform those conversations. We work with lots of organizations where they'll go through exercises to put consultants in health and beauty or in certain aisles to drive sales or protect stocks or reduce shrink. The cost of doing that needs to be understood, because sometimes absolutely it makes sense. Other times it can be a high cost with little return. So understanding, having the data, making informed decisions really helps, but also helps your messaging then to the teams on the front end to understand the why. So why are we doing this? What's the expectation? So it's joined up. And as I said, it shouldn't always be about cost, and you need to find that sweet spot of cost versus upskilling colleagues versus kind of selling more.
Yeah. And I love that idea about, it really depends on what that customer promise is, the type of retailer you are and why they're shopping in your store. If they're expecting the cheapest prices possible, then that's going to drag your attention, continually. And that way, if they're after a far more of an experience, and you start to strip out some of that, then you, as you said, you're breaking that brand promise, and that's going to affect, your relationship with your customers. So it makes a lot of sense. You touched on the actual sales associate themselves. Sometimes I think when we talk about productivity, it's easy to sort of forget we've got human beings, in this in this scenario. And I'm interested to know a little bit about what you see, perhaps with sort of changing behaviors in the type of people that are working in retail and their kind of expectations of work. Obviously, we can constantly ask them to do more and do more efficiently, but how does that play off against their expectations, and how do they kind of get bought into the change that follows that we want them to kind of adopt?
I think it's probably caveated with it. We know it's a difficult employment market. It's really difficult to get great people into retail and then keep them. And we've seen that in all kind of industries outside of retail as well. I think, in fairness to most retailers we work with, there's much more of an appreciation of employee experience than there was, my time in retail 15 years ago. So lots of surveys, like customer surveys, lots of monthly check-ins, maybe big surveys once a year or every 6 months to understand how all the employees, the associates, colleagues feel about the business. There's always lots of great untapped ideas in there as well, because we shouldn't forget they're the ones doing these processes every day. So they're the ones with the shortcuts. They're the ones with the why is the system slow. They're the ones with the we could do this better, or in this store we do it this way, and I worked in another store and they do it a different way, and I don't understand. So there's much more emphasis on the communication. So how do we get information to those frontline colleagues through apps, whatever it might be, but also being really clear on the messaging and the story. So this is what we're doing. This is why we're doing it. This is what we expect to happen, or this is the data we've got that's telling us what's going to happen, because they need to be part of the journey. If not, you'll spend a lot of time kind of recruiting people and retention will be low, which again comes back to the cost debate. It's maybe a hidden cost, but it's still people's time in the business to recruit, interview, induct, and then bring people up to speed. The average stat for people on the call, so the average time to competence, to somebody being competent in a role, is 24 to 28 weeks. So kind of half a year. So if you're losing people within that first year, you're barely getting people up to competence on average. So they're considered. Most of the retailers we work with, if not all, have a real passion for that comms piece, keeping the colleagues on board, but also pulling from their ideas as well.
Yeah. I mean, I can certainly back up what you're saying. We see this a lot with both the Miyagi product and the Rallyware product. One of the first questions we get asked is about onboarding and how quickly we can get staff members kind of up to speed, with the processes, with the knowledge that they need. Because as you say, with the average sort of length of tenure decreasing in retail, you really have to try and get them to a sort of productive point as quickly as possible, to make sure that you're actually, achieving the value that you want. And as you say, I think retailers are a lot better now at communicating and about making knowledge available. I think what's interesting and where we see the challenge is when you then introduce change to that. So they've been onboarded in a certain way. They know how to do something in a certain way. We talk about this in startups all the time on sort of making change the norm and sort of, create an organization where staff are very receptive to those things. Do you have any kind of tips, or do you see things that retailers specifically do well when it comes to sort of creating a mindset with employees where they're the ones that are actually always looking for those efficiencies and are quick to adopt new processes if they think they're going to help them?
Yeah, the continuous feedback loops. So some offer prizes or points or vouchers for bright sparks, good ideas that come back into kind of the senior team that get implemented. Having as limited channels of comms but consistent as possible. So again, organizations will have email, WhatsApp, Yammer, various apps to do things, and it becomes confusing and blended. And in some regards, things like WhatsApp are great because they're free, but they're unregulated. So I leave the business and I'm still in a group getting messages, but I've gone to work for a competitor. So there's all that to think through. I think what's interesting to see coming through in this whole reimagining retail is how you get the tech to drive the process. So how can you take the interpretation out? How can you take not some of the thinking out, but but get the tech to drive the flow rather than there be 10 different possible ways to do it. And a great example is kind of what we call stock counting. Some organizations we work with, if there's certain things to count on certain days, the system won't let you count it on the other days. So you've done it or you've not. And that's a KPI reporting compliance thing. But actually that button doesn't exist to count it on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, because we can only count it on a Friday. And as we get smarter with things like that, and tech gets smarter, and we'll touch on AI, I'm sure, that only making things available at the moment in time or the days we want it to happen can only be a good thing, because then you're not reliant on me knowing we do that on a Wednesday. I'll get prompted to do it. The button's there. I'll do it. If I'm not prompted, the button's not there.
And as you say, so many businesses rely on that tribal knowledge that exists at store level. And when people are turning over and leaving regularly, it can leave some real gaps, and suddenly things aren't being done that should have been done. So it makes a lot of sense to kind of use the systems and the tech that you have almost as guide rails. And I suppose in a lot of ways that actually frees the associate up to not have to spend too much brain power thinking about those things, and to instead be more focused on the customer. You mentioned some of the messaging apps there. Some of the things that we see really interesting is, we're now in a kind of a generation where those working in retail are very used to finding their own solutions to problems. And with the growth of freemium products, they often don't even need to pay for things. I see examples of this in our own business where our team are using their own tech stack of tools to do their work. And I think, as you said, we'll get on to AI in a second, but, ChatGPT-4, I think, is the kind of the best companion of every marketeer now, whether it's sort of, centrally sanctioned or adopted or not. But you did touch on messaging in particular, and I had a recent example of a retailer that we spoke to. And I said, what are stores using to communicate locally? And it was really down to the discretion of the store manager, whether that was Slack or WhatsApp or Facebook Messenger. The challenge was that when they then tried to introduce a central platform, they found it really difficult to then drive adoption on it, because it didn't have the feature set that was perhaps on WhatsApp or, on some of these other products. And so they found it quite hard to actually get them off it. But I just think it's really interesting how this generation, I think, is a bit more sort of willing to go and find their own solutions to problems. And I suppose that also creates a bit of a challenge for retailers when they're thinking about productivity, because they might not be aware of the tools and the resources that each store is using, and therefore not be able to scale that best practice or understand why one store is more efficient than the other. Do you see that do you share that sort of viewpoint in that sort of generation being a little bit more entrepreneurial, shall we say?
I think if I kind of cast my mind back to running shops, I think retailers have always been creative. If you're running a shop or working in a shop, you're the last line before it hits a customer. So if it's gone wrong, your shelves not arrived, your stock's not arrived, your promotional materials not arrived, you've got to get creative because there's nowhere else to go. So I think we've always been a breed of optimistic, creative individuals and teams of. Add tech into that, and clearly you open up a whole different world of apps you can use and products you can use. So that's for me where you've then got to harness that feedback loop to really understand where the breakdown in whatever the process is, but to try and get feedback of what people are using, how they're doing it, so you can then corporatize that within the defines of your business, whether that be from a cybersecurity point of view, from a data point of view, from a GDPR point of view. There's a whole bunch of stuff I'm sure we all know on the call that's a challenge, and having local implementations of something can seem fine, but clearly catch you out at points and cause a risk. So I think we've always been creative as retailers, certainly at the store location level, but tech's added a different angle to that and probably made it easier to solve some of those problems. But in doing that, almost unearthed different problems or potential issues around, some of those other bits I've mentioned.
Yeah, no, good. Okay. We're going to move on to a new topic. This one, when it came up, my sort of research team were putting together some talking points. And at first I was sort of a bit dismissive of, I don't understand why the relevance of this. But as you explained it, it really got me thinking. And since then, I've been thinking a lot more about the interplay. And that's the sort of the omni-channel world as we sort of are in this kind of blended world now of sort of online and in-store shopping. I hadn't really considered how the two impact each other from a productivity perspective. So perhaps you could talk a little bit about, what you see out there and how these kind of two sort of complementary but also competing parts of the business sort of butt up against each other.
Yeah. So I think omni-channel retailers work really hard and are doing a great job to blend the kind of experience across online and stores. Clearly, lockdown made people do things quicker, which I thought was quite interesting. So we had organizations in lockdown that kind of spun up online operations within 6 days, and it had been on their strategic roadmap for a couple of years. So it shows, again, the creativity and the can-do attitude. We're at an interesting place with omnichannel, I think. From a cost model point of view, I think it's really difficult to justify it in some areas. So if my local supermarket can pick and deliver my shopping for £1, if I pick the eco slot or sign up for the kind of yearly subscription for delivering, for me, that's great value. For them, £1 worth of labour, if you're paying somebody £11 an hour, is a couple of minutes, and they can't be picking my weekly shop in a couple of minutes. The maths don't add up. Then I've got to store it. Then I've got to put it on a van, which needs fuel or electricity to get to me. And someone's got to drive that van, and someone's then got to take it off and wait while I undo it. So the cost dynamic of certainly online grocery, I think, is entering a really interesting phase where it will become by default more expensive for us to access it as customers, which may price some people out of the market and drive footfall into store. So that's kind of grocery. The rest, I think, is interesting. We've done lots of study work on it around what we call the retrieval time. So the time when I go into the store through to then getting the parcel, I think the highest we've seen like 23 minutes. Would you believe? Pharmacy's done it really well for years. So if you get a repeat prescription, there's a great system typically where it's alphabetical. They'll then give you your prescription, read out your address, off you go. If you think of some retailers where they go from selling screws and nails to bathroom suites or from selling furniture, that's really tricky when you've opened up this inventory of everything you sell that I can then go and collect. So we probably wouldn't design our stores estates today in probably any retailer, other than maybe the Argos example and the Screwfix where it's behind the counter, the way that it is. So space and positioning of those goods is tricky. However, it drives opportunity. So again, the use of tech, smart marketing when you're picking up your parcels now to give people instant offers to then go and buy something in the store are becoming a lot more frequent. So blending those two journeys. So while you're here, give me something so I'll buy something while I'm there. There's a kind of ongoing debate, I think, from the store teams of who do I get the hours in my labour budget model to service these parcels if I'm picking them in the store or if I'm taking them off the wagon and then giving them out? Who gets the sale? Because intrinsically that's linked typically to bonus in retail. So could I be doing a lot of work for no reward? And retailers are working that through. Some have got a really good model. Some are still finding their way, but that becomes more extreme as we get the Black Friday weeks, we get the Christmas weeks, and volume grows into that channel. So I think the next couple of years are going to be interesting. Certainly when you look at any retailer's new store design, there's a lot more focus on where goods are stored, where goods are collected, behind the checkouts, in lockers out the front, so it can be 24/7 collection. What I do think is if you're a high volume omni-channel operator, certainly in grocery, that whole cost dynamic is going to be reconsidered, and probably as consumers we're going to take the cost if we opt into that channel, because it's not sustainable to do it for the cost that's operating at the moment.
Yeah, no, I hadn't really thought about it like that, but there are obviously a lot more costs that are going into the online shopping, particularly with grocery. But I also think what a phenomenal opportunity for bricks and mortar retailers that have an omni-channel element because ultimately it's just driving more footfall. And like you said, there's so many opportunities with the right processes in place to convert that footfall into even more sales as well. I remember talking to a retailer a few years ago that had built their system so that it would actually show whoever was managing that collection, it would show them what other items were in that person's basket, at the point that they checked out that they perhaps didn't complete on. And that creates some really great opportunities to say, like, I know you were looking at this particular product. Did you want to have a look at it up close? To increase that sort of customer transaction value and basket price, when the two start to work together. But again, I wonder from a productivity perspective, if it's another scenario where, typically they're two different teams, retail operations from a physical store estate, and then the online sort of distribution and fulfillment, who are perhaps kind of taking advantage of what they see as this kind of this labor resource that's ready to do things for them, not realizing how they're kind of already allocated or what additional burdens that creates, like you say, on a Black Friday or something like that. There's probably so many collections, there's not enough time to actually serve the customers that are coming in.
Yeah, which is back to are the teams getting the hours for the parcels they're picking or that they're dealing with. And then there's a whole other debate on returns. So yes. Actually, I generate more work by returns coming back. Some of that may go straight back onto the shelf. Some of that might be products I don't even stock in my store. So is that marked down? Is that sent back centrally? Is it sent to another store? So when you start to really map out some of these journeys, there's lots of different routes in and out. But I think the key thing at a local level is, if I'm servicing 3,000 parcels a week, am I getting the resource to do that in my staff budget? Hopefully. And even better, am I getting the sale associated with it? Because we're doing the work. And, it's proven, back to your point, there is that halo effect of instant rewards when people collect, that conversation about, as you said, we know you bought this is complimentary, or when you were browsing, this may have been out of stock, it's come in. So there's a real opportunity, but that all, again, back to the fundamentals of this conversation, relies on your retail colleagues being there at the right time, being able to do the right work at the right time, so they're free to have those conversations.
Yeah. Let's deep dive into tech a little bit, because you've mentioned a few times, and obviously it has huge benefits when we think about sort of productivity and just the general customer experience. What sort of technology are retailers investing in? There's always, I know you've recently gone to the retail show down in London, and it seems like every year there's a fad or a focus or something that's kind of 80% of the booth. So what's kind of happening in that world at the moment, and how are retailers using technology to drive productivity?
I think there's some general trends. There seems to be a trend around stock management systems, people systems, whether that be workforce management, task management, HR. And some of that's driven by buying cycles, people buying 4 or 5 year contracts, and they tend to be a cycle when it comes. At the moment, we seem to be in an EPOS stroke stock management cycle. Learning and comms, and how that's all integrated into apps to reach frontline employees. And I think learning's really interesting. If you've got high labour turnover, actually helping people learn in a structured way at their pace, the right way, is really important, rather than we'll just train you locally in the store, because you then inherit all the inherent inefficiencies in the process they might follow. Headsets, I'm sure you've all seen the rise of headsets in most of the retailers you work with. I think that's a byproduct of two things. One, there being less people in shops, so harder to communicate, and two, shrink. So actually there's a safety net in there, and some really neat ways where they're being linked to security announcements, and it's coming where they'll be linked to age verification on self-checkout, so we can do that remotely. So a foundational piece to enhance future productivity opportunities. Communication. So again, as a store leader, if I've got less people potentially, or more people working shorter shifts, I'm probably not going to see them every week. If it's part-time people, students, maybe not even bi-weekly or monthly. So how do we have consistent comms? Lots of protocols around security. So, TVs and cameras in aisle, through to things like beers, wines, and spirits being locked behind screens that you have to call a colleague to service that. Again, all predicated on the fact you've got enough people at the right time to service that demand. Otherwise, you kind of reduce shrink, but also reduce sales. And the obvious one, self-checkout. So, we've all seen the rise of self-checkout. I was reading something, I think it was yesterday, it was just over 21 years, I think, since Tesco's put the first self-checkout in. So we're well versed in that, through to the Amazon Fresh autonomous shopping model for those that have been, and Tesco's have played with it, and Sainsbury's have played with it, and some others. So we seem to be in stock people EPOS transition, but with that supplementary tech around it. Yeah,
very cool. And boring fact for you, my mum was part of the company that did that original Tesco system as well. So there's my claim to fame.
There you go.
Now, it has been impressive to see, how much new technology. I think you're right. The headsets, I think, is a bit of a game changer for sort of operational communication. And the other thing that we've seen, particularly with probably more so with Rallyware, is the level of consolidation that's happening around the employee experience. I think, if we go back sort of 7 or 8 years ago, we saw an explosion of new startups and new tech tackling every individual facet, whether that was sort of time and attendance, learning, comms. And then suddenly what you realize is the poor old sales associate has got, 19 different apps that they have to have logins for, and they have to, know where to go to use each one. And that in itself is going to be, a challenge when it comes to productivity. And so what we've certainly seen is a level of sort of consolidation. We've seen it with the big learning platforms that have moved into task management and communication, as we have as well. And I think what's most interesting about that is that it's forcing retailers to work much more sort of cross-functionally than they have in the past. The amount of retailers that I speak to that, the HR team is responsible for the learning platform. And if, the retail ops team wants to kind of put some specific content that relates to, not just in case learning, if you like, but something that needs to be done today, there's this sort of internal battle of who controls the technology and when can messages be put out. And what seems to be happening now is more joined up thinking around the technology that the sales associate's engaging with. And let's be honest, learning, communication, being able to instantly look up information is useful to all different functions. Retail ops want to send out surveys to figure out, whether there's better ways of doing things, as do the learning and development department to understand how people are feeling. So it's nice to see that we're starting to become a bit more sales associate centric and think about the sales associates. Are you seeing the same things, or are you an advocate of, some of these platforms are starting to play in areas that they're not necessarily experts in?
I think it depends on the tech organization, doesn't it? Some are very clear of this is where we're good at, and they'll work with partners in their ecosystem to bring in specialists. Others will want to develop wherever they're led by their customers. Again, I think you're absolutely right. The key needs to be thinking about the colleagues in the front line of, they don't want 19 apps to work out where they need to go, because we're then back in a world of making them unproductive. So how do you consolidate that into one place, or have something that links through to all of those but surfaces the data they need easily? I think it's mixed, but we need to just keep the front end colleague in mind of making their life as easy as possible, because they've got 1,000,001 things they'll be asked to do by lots of different people.
And specifically when retailers are implementing new technology, is your business involved in doing those kind of pre and post studies to try and understand what type of impact those systems have had, and where the additional opportunities are to get even more use from them?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're doing lots around electronic shelf edge labels at the moment. So how long does it take to do your price changes now, the volume, the reprints, the promotional point of sale? then the organization will put into a couple of stores their electronic shelf edge labels and will validate the business case. So we're doing two things really. One, saying this is the benefit you thought you were going to get, or that solution provider said you would get. That's correct. There's more, there's less. There's some other things to think about in there. And two, making sure then in their label modeling world, they extract the right number of hours out or reinvest the right number of hours somewhere else. So it's a validation piece, but also a kind of protection piece, because if people are claiming double benefits or there's multiple projects going in, sometimes there's a compound effect, sometimes there's competing, and other times some of the technology. So it takes longer to type something into a system than it does to write it on a piece of paper. So you can bake in benefits that aren't necessarily real, but are there to get that project in the business. So it's crystallizing that and making it kind of real from an operational point of view.
Yeah, no, very good. Right then, big topic, and we're going to move on. You mentioned it earlier. AI. I imagine this is one of the kind of things you saw at the show recently. It's certainly something that we're sort of quite far down the line with, but it's also, I suppose, sometimes a lack of substance behind the claims that are actually existing. How are you guys thinking about AI, both within your own business, but also, as you're working with retailers, what are you seeing their kind of reaction to a lot of the new tech that's coming out and the new opportunities it opens up?
So I think, within ReThink, we're probably like everybody dipping our toes in the water. So we're looking at what it can do for us. We've got a lot of data. So our belief is that there must be some bigger correlations we can get to with the help of AI and maybe other data sets. So our data plus EPOS data from our clients, customer experience data, adding in weather. So we think there's much more power we can get to in our insights with that, and probably quicker. And there's a bunch of stuff we've probably not even thought about that when it gets really sophisticated, it'll hopefully say, and you didn't think about this. So huge opportunity. From a retailer's point of view, I think they're still trying to work it out. There's a recognition that you need to be doing or looking at it, but what you do with it, what are the user cases, they're not quite sure. And it's one of those areas where there's lots of noise. It's moving very quickly. We're on, as you said, ChatGPT 4.0, 5's due out, I think, in September. So if you're doing nothing, that's probably a warning sign. If you're doing a lot, that's probably a warning sign, because, again, I'm not quite sure people know what questions or user cases they're trying to answer. There's some really interesting ones around facial recognition I talked about on self-checkouts, which can use it. Remote age verification, that kind of stuff. It feels like it's big. Could I sit here and tell you 10 user cases in retail today? Probably not. But you probably need to be looking at it. And you'll see in lots of software solutions, we'll use Workforce Manager as an example. They'll talk about the AI algorithms. They've probably been there for a while, is the reality. It's a nice marketing rebrand. The bit I think that's missing is the intelligence bit. At the moment, you have to feed these machines questions or data, and they'll give you an answer or they'll give you some suggestions. My assumption is the next part is they'll start to come back to us with some questions or suggestions based on just that heartbeat of data that keeps going in. So I think there's loads to go at. I think it's really exciting. Some people will be scared by it as well, understandably. But it can only be a benefit in lots of binary businesses, probably more law and some healthcare bits. There must be a massive benefit in speeding up answers where there's lots of history of very standardized or binary cases that it can come to a conclusion on. Retail's probably, there's a lot more random stuff that happens in retail that's probably difficult, but there's opportunity, absolutely.
Yeah. I know I've reached a certain age now because I'm thinking back to sort of when the internet really kind of gained traction, and there was that kind of two camp mentality of, it's going to change the world, and another camp that's kind of like, well, I'm not going to rush to adopt this. And it definitely feels like another big leap where it's going to change the game. And I'm certainly on the side of it. It is going to change pretty much everything. But I also want to pull out some specific points you made there, because I think it's really good counsel for everybody, is that, just going out and investigating AI, I think, can lead retailers to getting interested in things that aren't solving real problems for them. And you mentioned there, I think it's very important to actually start with the problem in mind and understand what you're trying to improve and why, and then find out what potential solutions there are out there and whether AI is potentially one of them that can help. Because otherwise, I think, it's very easy to get pulled down the rabbit hole of every business claiming that they have AI, when actually there's very minimal levels of AI and they're not really solving the important problems for you. They're kind of very peripheral to what the solution is designed to do. So yeah, have you seen good and bad examples already of where people have spent decent amount of time and effort on looking at AI, or is it only really starting to kind of happen now?
I think some of the bigger organizations have set up teams to look at it. Again, is it the tail wagging the dog or the dog wagging the tail? It's back to that at a board level. I'm sure there's lots of conversations of what are we doing with AI? How are we thinking about it? But back to the point we both made, it's almost starting with what are the problems we're trying to solve? And does AI do that? Or actually, is it just a different way of analysis? Is it more data science? So maybe people trying to fit AI in because it's the place to be. We'll see. Time will tell, but I suspect there's a mix of people who are sitting and waiting, seeing what others do, which is fine, but kind of don't get left behind, through to others who are burning a lot of people and therefore money, but almost are going to come back with no concrete conclusions of the problems they've actually solved.
Yeah, very good. We're going to start to wrap up, conscious of time. I want to leave a few minutes for questions, but there was something specific you mentioned in our prep that I wanted to call out and just get you to talk a little bit about, which was to look outside of the store when you're thinking about productivity. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what you meant by that.
Yeah, so we're doing lots of work with organizations now, looking at their field teams, so regional roles, area roles, typically more expensive roles, so there's less of them, but carry a higher cost base. And that's about how are they spending their time. So are they doing lots of traveling? Are they doing, and what we're typically seeing is lots of admin, so dealing with emails from different people, different departments, texts, calls, WhatsApp. That's an expensive time for those people. Collation of data, when data sits in head office and somebody can probably pull more accurate data quicker. So what's the value of their role? And it's always fascinates me that when we start to get the insights, how little time they typically spend with customers, and then with their teams, because of all the other stuff that gets in the way. And indicators for us are things like they have an admin day, or Friday afternoons admin time, and they then do admin at home. That kind of stuff is the warning signs of, so where's the value in that? How do you streamline that, digitize that? How do you gatekeep it, get the right information to the right people? Because they're all great people, and their value is being with their teams and driving the commercial conversation, driving the customer conversation, doing all the coaching and development bit, not answering X, Y, and Z email from certain departments in different offices around promotional material or other things that can be surfaced somewhere else. And the same with head office teams and store leadership teams. When people are conscious of cost, they're big cost bases that sometimes aren't considered outside of the overall kind of labor budget for a location or the store or bricks and mortar locations, but have immense power and value.
Yeah, no, good advice. To sum up a little bit, we've given lots of context, lots of advice today, but for somebody out there that's thinking, look, we've got a lot of pressure on cost or maybe shrink or whatever's driving the conversation, how, and I'm sure people are already started with these things, they just don't not realize it, but as an expert, how would you advise people to really sort of get into the productivity conversation, and where should they start when they're thinking about it?
Yeah, so I think that there's kind of four bits we think about. So do you know how long things take? Because if you don't know how long things take, you've got no evidence or data to make decisions on. So that time and motion study I talked about, or we call them productivity reviews. So you need the fundamental data to help you make decisions. Some of it you'll have a gut feel for, some of it will be a surprise. Have you then got the right people doing the right tasks? Have you got expensive leaders doing lots of filling? Have you got expensive field teams doing lots of admin? Because there's an intrinsic cost there, and as cost goes up, it costs you more to do that work. Think about the future. So all the exciting stuff that's on the plan, but how do you balance that off with rising costs of national living wage, which we know comes every April, and we're never quite sure until probably the January what that step's going to be. So how are we reducing the workload? How are we digitizing that workload to free us up the cost and capacity to do the cool stuff? And how does that fit with your customer proposition? Because it's all got to be aligned. Are you actively taking people away from customers? Is that part of the decision? Or actually, are you doing that subconsciously, and therefore you're going to damage the brand and the reputation? So there's no perfect answer, but you need that kind of rounded approach. If you look after your colleagues, you're transparent with them, you've got those bits of process and the right people doing the right things in mind, it should all underpin what you're trying to do for your customer.
Perfect. Really good advice. We're going to wrap up with a couple of questions that I can see here in the chat before sort of talking about how people can get in touch with you. So one of the questions here, what are the typical sample sizes needed when doing productivity studies to ensure that you get representative data, basically?
So there's kind of two aspects. One is variation. So if we're looking at a store estate, we'll want to see a couple of different locations, managers with different tenures, so we get that variation. Sometimes there's a political aspect in business as well. So you've got to do London because people think it's less productive or more productive. You've got to do Scotland, Ireland, because they maybe deal with different currencies. So there's no hard and fast rule. It depends on size of organization, number of processes, and then how that fits with kind of any political views in the business. But typically we've done organizations with 300 shops, and we've done 8 to 10 stores to get a representative view across their market.
Gotcha. Okay. If you have got any other questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm just going to move to one more that I can see here. And this is probably something that a lot of retailers get started at when they look at productivity, but seasonal demand can be a roller coaster for retailers. What are some of the smart ways that retailers are managing these ups and downs? So I guess, thinking about kind of workforce management, making sure you got the right number of people in the right stores at the right time.
Yeah, so typically the answer was you go out and you get a load of temps and throw them at your Christmas, if that's your big point, or Easter, wherever it is. That's proving trickier and trickier, as we know, with recruitment, and is a big cost and a big challenge because the people come and go, and do they provide the right service? How do you train them, etc. So yeah, we've seen people probably in the last, since lockdown, use less temps, some none at all. Smarter in terms of the workforce management solutions they use. So the shape of customers, the hours that they need, getting those people deployed, publishing rotas further in advance so people that are part-time can take advantage in those peak seasons, through to moving people across stores. So if you're lucky enough to have multiple stores in small geographies, can you open up shifts for me in location B because I'm already trained and I just want extra hours? And on a broader view, where they allocate the budget, contracting to a point in the year that's not the lowest, but it's not the highest. So actually, if sales aren't great, we've protected the business and ourselves, but we're not contracting to such a high base with lock-in cost, or such a low base that when sales grow, and therefore we need to do more things, we can't flex people into those hours. So it's tricky, always has been, but we are seeing less reliance on temps, and therefore that cost disappears, but much more strategy in how you get to a base contract for a location, and then how you can move people within and around locations, or even across locations, to fill those kind of bumps in the road where we get busy.
Very good advice. And Simon, I want to say a huge thank you on behalf of everybody today for sharing your knowledge and your expertise with us. It's been a real privilege. I'm going to share a slide on the screen now. If you want to get in touch with Simon, please feel free to make a note. Simon, quick couple of seconds just to plug the book as well, because I know that's a great way for people to learn more about this topic.
Yeah, we've got the book. I'll hold it up if you can just see it. So yeah, every second counts. So if you like a copy of the book, it's not kind of bedtime reading. It's chapters that you can pick up and put down. Hopefully gives you some practical advice. Drop me an email with your address and we'll post you a copy. We've got our weekly podcast that you can sign up to on all the channels, Spotify, Apple, etc. And we also do a yearly conference in Birmingham. So 12th of September this year. We're kind of at capacity, but feel free to register on the website again at rethinkproductivity.co.uk.
Brilliant. Thanks so much for being our guest today. It's been a pleasure and a privilege. And thank you to all of you for coming along and listening. We will be sending out an email in the coming days with the recording. So if you didn't manage to make it today, you'll be able to catch up there. And if you have any questions on Rallyware or Miyagi by Rallyware, feel free to drop us an email back and one of our team will be in touch. Thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.